Hi there, I'm Andreas Marazis, host of the ENC podcast, and this is the ENC In-Depth. Today we have with us two distinguished speakers. Right next to me, Dr. Maria Raquel Freire, Associate Professor in International Relations and Jean Monnet Chair at the University of Coimbra, and also visiting scholar at the University of Leuven. Hi there. And to my far right, Dr. Rick Fawn, who is Professor of International Relations at the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews, and ENC Academic Council member. He also convenes the St. Andrews section of the Around the Caspian Marie Curie Innovative Training Network, which is funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program. Earlier today, ENC organized in cooperation with the University of St. Andrews and the European Institute of Peace an academic conference dedicated on the launch of the latest ENC Perspectives policy publication entitled Threats to Stability in Wider Europe. The EU faces severe challenges along its eastern and southern flanks. The publication brings together 8 in-depth research articles by leading regional academics and experts with a range of long-standing and international perspectives, new ideas and government experience. This study anticipates challenges and opportunities for the EU and member states, emanating from Russia, Russia's North Caucasus, Turkey, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and Central Asia. The findings are not only about risk identification and management, but also about the positive projection of the EU into wider Europe and Eurasia. In this first part of this special in-depth discussion, our two experts will focus on the role of external actors in wider Europe's security, with an emphasis on the instruments that the EU, US, and Russia have on their disposal, and how their interests collide, posing threat to stability in the eastern neighborhood and beyond. So, Maria, Rick, welcome to ENC In-Depth. Maria, let me start with you first. 5 out of 6 countries in the Eastern Partnership are affected by frozen and or ongoing conflicts. Russia is involved in all of them. Since we are on our way to the 5th Eastern Partnership Summit, which will take place in Brussels in late November, how realistic it is to believe that the European integration process is still a valid tool when it comes to conflict management or conflict resolution? We know that each of the 6 members have chosen their own path to integration with the EU, and often some of them are critical of the EU's conflict resolution policy. So what's your take?
So I would start probably by saying that this integration into the EU is somehow informal integration. We are not really talking about accession, at least in the short, medium term, I would say. But the Eastern Partnership has been clearly an important tool in terms of approximation of these countries into the EU rules and procedures. The problem was that the rationale for this policy was to create bonds at different levels, social, cultural, economic, political, so it's a very broad policy and multi-level policy also. But what happened in Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea clearly put into question somehow the very own reach of this policy in terms of its goals of stabilization of the European neighborhood. So the very first idea of creating a ring of friends around the EU, in the EU periphery, let's say, at the EU borders, somehow got caught in the middle of this broader conflict with Russia. And so the framework now is under fire somehow. So I can see some potential in the Eastern Partnership, and I think it is a very important tool, and for the moment is the tool the EU has. And so deepening lines of and projects and lines of investment in these different sectorial areas with these countries, I believe it's still important in terms of this logic of transformative diplomacy of the EU. Although it's also very interesting if you think of the 2016 global strategy, the shifting focus from democratization to human rights somehow, and so somehow there are some competing trends here, because I think the EU is facing a moment where some options will have to be made, because the credibility of the policy has been questioned by many, including within Europe, many experts, many analysts, in terms of its true potential to really bring these societies closer and promote security and stability, right? So it's...
I wanted to move a little bit further with you, Rick, and ask you something related to Russia. It was also mentioned in the revision of the ENP and also in the EU global strategy that there will be a special attention on conflict, EU's role in conflict resolution, crisis management, capacity building, and so on. But can we really talk in the Eastern Partnership framework about conflict resolution without cooperating with Russia, who is basically involved in every single crisis? And how can we work with Russia when we have high officials like Mr. Lavrov, who criticizes in every occasion the Eastern Partnership framework as a problematic one, and how we can accommodate Russia in that sense?
Andres, this is a series of very astute questions, very difficult questions. Accommodating Russia is fundamentally difficult. And perhaps the starting point on that is that I think the Eastern Partnership, which was very well intended, actually alarmed Russia. Russia previously did not have a problem with the actual enlargements of the European Union. That includes to Central Europe, to the Baltic, to Southeastern Europe. However, the EAP was a different issue in its outreach and the countries questioned. The Baltic states, even though they were in the Soviet Union for 4 decades, were treated differently by Moscow than, say, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, or the South Caucasus. And the EAP was encroaching on, as Moscow saw it, post-Soviet space, the Russian sphere of influence. And as I said, I think the EAP was extremely well intended, but it could have been better explained to Russia. And I think there were some very awkward times where senior Russian officials were essentially told by the EU that it wasn't their affair. And in some senses we can understand that, because the EU believes that countries have a right to choose their foreign policy orientations, and that's a very, very important principle. But nevertheless, we know, you mentioned senior Russian officials, every major senior Russian official issued some statement on the threat that was the EAP in their view, and what became the Vilnius Summit in 2013, that it was fundamentally a zero-sum game, that countries were being forced to choose. So that's a backdrop to a very large dilemma in dealing with Russia. And of course, the EU had created common spaces with Russia, had regularized summits with it, and so forth, but this was a turning point. And a turning point that I think wasn't recognized at the time was not actually Ukraine bulking from the Vilnius Summit, but Armenia, 2 months before. Little Armenia, dare I say, little Armenia, and geographically more removed. That should have been a signal. This was the first time that any country rejected EU values. And that is what the Armenian regime did when it said it wasn't going to go along with the Vilnius Summit. Then it became a crisis point when the Ukrainian government backed out. And also, as a great fillip to the value of the European Union, we got the Maidan protests, which were probably the very first time that we had some 800,000 people protesting in favor of the European Union. So we have a fundamental gap in values, which I think is incredibly difficult to bridge. And that's before we get to the very astute question you asked about dealing with the conflicts in these countries. And indeed, 5 of the 6 EAP countries do have conflicts. Now, we phrased that question in terms of Russia being involved in those conflicts. Moscow would probably say that it's not involved in those conflicts. In terms of Armenia, Azerbaijan, over Karabakh, the Russian position first would be to say, we are a mediator. Formally, we're part of the Minsk group. And after 2008, interestingly, coincidentally, following the Russian-Georgian War, Medvedev convened a number of presidential summits, probably with the okay of the other Minsk group members. But here was Russia bringing the Armenian and Azerbaijani president regularly to Russia to try to show that Russia was a mediator. So Russia's position is, we're not a conflict party, we are mediators. Now, there are difficulties with that, of course, because Russia, at a minimum, supplies both sides with arms. So it's a rather strikingly ironic position to be an arms supplier to both sides and a formal mediator. But the Russian position would be that they're not parties to that conflict. You go to Moldova, they don't frame it in those terms either. When you go down to Georgia, I think the Russian, in a few words, the Russian position is that they are defending vulnerable people who have been subjected to horrific abuses by the Jordanians. Again, that would be the Russian position in defense of their positions towards the Abkhaz and the South Ossetians. That it's a altruistic, a moralistic position that Russia has adopted to protect peoples. But the question is very, very opposite. What do we do with a Russia that has a hand in various forms in these conflicts? And I haven't even mentioned Ukraine. That's a particularly difficult one because we have the outright annexation of Crimea, there's no question about that, and the divergent views about Donbass, about eastern Ukraine, where Russia is still engaging in a kind of plausible deniability. We're not really in there, whereas Western governments accept and argue that Russia is itself involved in eastern Ukraine. So there are no easy answers, and that's partly because Russia has been very astute, very stealthful in how it has involved itself in all these conflicts, how it's used a range of tools, hard and soft, and ones that fundamentally are at odds with EU values. The EU, as a values-based institution, not a hard power entity, doesn't have the means, doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the expectation to deal with these kinds of challenges. So that's the fundamental challenge, that the EU has a different value set and therefore a different toolbox for dealing with conflicts that involve Russia in the Eastern Partnership.
So, well, with this last comment, you gave me the opportunity to express my next question, which is related on if there is any role for the EU in terms of like being on the negotiations table in any of these conflicts, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it is in Georgia or in Nagorno-Karabakh. We know for a fact that several formats are in place for decades, whether it is the Minsk in Nagorno-Karabakh, whether it is the 5+2 in Transnistria, or this Normandy format, which is already more than 2.5 years that already exists, and we don't see any progress. We basically are in a stalemate. So maybe it's time to think of different formats, and since we're like in this format, an informal discussion, which is called the ENC In-Depth, but how we can openly like brainstorm a little bit and see what kind of formats we can have, what kind of role can EU have in these negotiations.
Well, again,
it's open for both of you, so please.
I'll just say a couple of opening comments. I mean, you're very right. I mean, in the first of the three cases that you mentioned, we have a format that goes back almost a quarter of a century, and it speaks for itself that there's not been any real palpable change in the conflict dynamics in those cases. And it's not just a question of the EU. When we think about the Karabakh conflict, Azerbaijan has been calling for the EU to be one of the co-chairs. Frankly, they want France replaced by the European Union. So it's not just a dynamic on the EU side. There are conflict parties who would like much more EU involvement in it. Going back to the Eastern Partnership, I mean, there is a lot of value added in that. In that, I think the EU is trying to export workable, important values to these countries, and values that would help the societies, to make those societies more open, more secure, more pluralistic, more understanding, and therefore, I would hope, in the long run, open to the idea of at least understanding the other side in the conflicts, if not also eventually coming to a mutual understanding.
It's not a very easy question because it really gets into how the EU could eventually be creative in terms of its engagement. I think the EU is already being creative somehow. For example, when we think about what is going on in Nagorno-Karabakh with all the people contacts and the projects involving civil society, it's a very interesting way to raise awareness and to bring people together.
This capacity building mechanism
exactly,
that the EU has.
on the ground, and I think these are the kind of activities that the EU does very well and has already some expertise on the ground. So the fact that it is not formally involved in these formats, be them plus something or minus something or whatever, doesn't mean it cannot contribute. And I think somehow the EU has been contributing. And if it has the capacity to build trust and raise awareness and work a little bit bottom-up strategies, somehow it is also contributing to the conflict resolution. But of course, it's different from being at the talks, at the mediation level. But I think it's also an important dimension that sometimes we just forget that is going on there.
Well, these elements are basically the ones that label EU as a soft power when it comes to conflict resolution and so on. And one of these tools, I'm sure that you are both aware, is this EU 2009 non-recognition and engagement policy towards Abkhazia and South Ossetia that focuses on de-isolation and conflict transformation. Do you think such a tool, which was, by the way, not so heavily publicized, and EU's role was like minimal because it was a lot of partners and it wasn't always EU on the forefront, like holding the flag saying that we implemented this. So we didn't get credit, the EU. So do you think that this tool is still valid?
Essentially, yes. I would say it's first a creative policy. It tries to square a very difficult circle because the EU's position is of territorial integrity. So it's saying, well, I mean, that's particularly aimed towards Georgia, but it's saying generally towards Moldova, now for the past 2 years towards, or 2.5 years towards Ukraine, that we recognize the 1991 borders. We do not recognize the forcible annexation, i.e. Crimea, or the de facto, that is the partial recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So there cannot be recognition in that sense. It goes against the Helsinki Final Act, it goes against the EU's principles, and it goes against the interests of countries like Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia. At the same time, the EU is interested in people, and we shouldn't forget that. And a lot of policies that the EU generates is towards, and I genuinely believe this, towards societal betterment. And one of the strengths that the EU has is a kind of role model, saying to people, look what you get from freedom of movement. Look what you get from the support that we give to higher education by making a pan-European class of people. And that's very, I try to go to Abkhazia once a year. That resonates with Abkhaz. Abkhaz youth want to study in Europe. Very, very attractive to them. And the only way, if they can pull it off, to do that is to do it on a Russian passport. And many of them don't want to do that. So the EU actually has a lot of attractive power in that way. So I think engaging with people rather than de facto entities through many of these means is extremely helpful. And it allows the EU still not to be recognizing in the outright sense of these would-be states. And again, that would go against its principles, it would upset EAP countries, and it would play, frankly, into Russia's hands. So to answer your question, yeah, I think there's quite a lot of utility in the strategy.
Okay. I would like to conclude our discussion with one question related to sanctions. Recently, we saw that the EU extended for 6 more months the sanctions. Also, just a few days before, US also extended their sanctions. What is interesting here is that, okay, the West must stand firm when it comes to sanctions against Russia's aggression. But the question is, individually, each state or each partner on its own, or as one voice? Why I'm saying that? On the 15th of June, the US Senate voted for new sanctions without coordinating with the EU. On top of that, one of the provisions enabling the US to impose sanctions on European firms involved in financing Russian energy export pipelines to Europe, of course including Nord Stream 2. So how do you evaluate this move? Please.
I would say that the West should be, let's say the West, we're talking about United States and European Union, basically, that's how we put it, should be coordinated in terms of speaking at one voice. But here we have two issues. First, we have the leadership of Donald Trump in Russia, whose policy towards Russia has been not very clear, so it's quite ambivalent. There are signs of rapprochement to Russia. The following day there are some signs of distancing, criticism, and so it's not a very coherent and clear foreign policy. And on the other hand, we have the EU itself, and the need for the EU also to speak at one voice. If we go back to the time when the decision to agree on the sanctions was made, if we well remember, it took some time for the EU states to coordinate among themselves and reach that decision, after which then they have stick together and they have been more coherent, let's say, in their approach. But also within the EU, sometimes it's not that easy regarding relations with Russia to find all coherence that is very much needed. But I think it is important to coordinate, and that Russia sees the West and the transatlantic link is still a strong one.
Basically, Russia is trying to take advantage of every crack, whether it is between US-EU relations or even within the EU member states, so to take advantage.
But that's not new.
No, that's not new. That's not new. But we're
Russian
giving them more
policy.
tools, like to. Yep. What about you, Rick? What do you think?
Well, I mean, what we're seeing is a function of our pluralistic systems. When you talk about there being cracks, it's one of our virtues that we are pluralistic. There are different interests, there are different expressions of things. But yes, Russia is very stealthful in exploiting these, be it funding extremist parties across Europe, or using the energy tool, or having very savvy social media and televisual imagery, across Western Europe. But I think we shouldn't underestimate also how much EU resolve there's been. The European Monitoring Mission in Georgia was put together in a matter of days, with virtually every country contributing. The EU is the principal supporter, both in terms of money and personnel, to the OSCE Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. We have a sanctions regime in place. I mean, of course, there are some discordant interests within the European Union, but considering that, I think that the relative unity is quite substantial. I would certainly want that to remain. I would like to see more of it, but we shouldn't underestimate how much there is. And I think it would be very, very important for those who have voices to keep saying that we need this, that we need unity on it. And I think some of the targeting that the EU has done is important and effective. I mean, I think particularly targeting Russian elites is a way to bring this home. I think it's important to try not, of course it's been exploited by Russian media, but try not to target Russian society, not to make average Russians feel that they're in some way targeted. So I think differentiated sanctions, which are in place, which are EU sanctions, are actually an effective tool, and they are an expression of EU unity.
We can even add in this list of people, as you mentioned, elites. We can also add in this list, maybe in the future, journalists and editors who are involved in misinformation campaigns, so as to tackle Russian propaganda, for example. That's also a possibility.
Well, certainly. Well, I mean, I certainly applaud what the EU has done, and the ideas, the initiatives of Stratcom, of actually getting the EU message out in better and more accessible ways, and countering the misinformation that is being generated.
But I would also add, apart from initiatives like the Stratcom, there were also cases, maybe a couple of years ago, where individual member states were funding, for example, UK funded a project in Ukraine which was called Stop Fake. So maybe we need more such initiatives on the ground, funded by individual member states. The EU can do as much, but of course more ownership on behalf of the member states is also important. This is also highlighted in the strategies, in the Eastern Partnership and other strategies as well. So maybe this is also another possibility. I mean, to do more. It's already happening, but maybe we can do more. Well, I would like to thank you both for your contribution in this discussion. That was very fruitful. That was the ENC In-Depth, and thank you all for being here with us.